All the names you can trust. This is Newstalk ZB News.
Good morning, it's 6 o'clock. I'm Donna-Marie Lever. It's gone from bad to worse in the Middle East as Iran faces the aftermath of Israeli attacks. Israel's army says its precise strikes on Iranian military targets are in retaliation to continuous attacks from Iran. The Iranian army says it successfully countered the aggression despite killing 2 soldiers. Geopolitical analyst Jeffrey Miller expects the death toll will continue to climb.
This is another wave of escalation. With everything that's going on in the Middle East, it would be unwise to think this will be the last round of direct strikes between Iran and Israel, sadly.
Mike Hosking, Marcus Lush, Pete Wolfcamp, Heather Duplessis-Allen. All the names you can trust. This is Newstalk ZB News.
Good morning, it's 7 o'clock. I'm Donna-Marie Lever. A geopolitical analyst says the latest escalation in the Middle East has destroyed any chance of a ceasefire in the near future. Israel's army says it unleashed strikes on Iranian military targets in retaliation to continuous attacks from Iran. The Iranian army says it successfully countered the aggression despite killing 2 soldiers. Geopolitical analyst Jeffrey Miller doubts it will result in any de-escalation.
In the end, there is no military solution to what we're seeing in the Middle East. There is only a political one, and you will not solve this conflict by military means.
And hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Weekend Collective. This Sunday, the 27th of October, I'm Tim Beveridge. We're with you through till 6 o'clock. You can text your feedback anytime, 9292. You can check out the podcast if you miss any hours. Just look for the Weekend Collective on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, or the Newstalk ZB website. Gosh, the choice is endless. By the way, if you do text, don't forget standard text charges apply. So what we've got coming up today, coming up in a moment, Politics Central for the next hour, where I'll be having a chat with Jeffrey Miller. He's a geopolitical analyst on Israel's recent attack on Iran. And then
Politics Central.
And yes, yesterday, our time, about now actually, 24 hours ago, the Israeli Defense Force carried out multiple strikes on Iranian military targets, killing 4 soldiers. Israel's army has said the attacks are in retaliation to continuous attacks from Iran. The President of the United States, Joe Biden, says, somewhat optimistically I think, that he's hopeful that this will mark the end of a months-long a cycle of escalation, but many experts are concerned this is going to worsen the conflict. And with me now is geopolitical analyst Jeffrey Miller. Jeffrey, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Tim.
Was this a valid response from Israel?
Well, Israel will see it that way. It was a carefully calibrated response. It targeted mainly military sites in Iran, around 20 different sites in 3 different locations. So it was significant, but what it did not do was target oil facilities or nuclear facilities, and there's been a lot of talk and concern that Israel would seek to do that, would seek to undertake a large-scale strike, just given what Israel's been doing, particularly in Lebanon in the last few months. We just had every reason to think that there would be a large-scale response from Israel. I think it was a significant response, and in a wider context, it was a very big response by Israel yesterday. But I think Israel also, to some degree, stepped back from the brink here, and it didn't go for that for those nuclear facilities, oil facilities, because of US pressure behind the scenes. And I think Benjamin Netanyahu decided to just step back a little bit and not go too far.
What was it specifically in retaliation to in terms of what Iran had been doing? Because they'd fired a bunch of missiles at Israel, hadn't they?
That's right. Look, it's hard for everyone to keep up here because we've had so many, responses and counter-responses and rounds of escalation this year. It's hard for anyone to keep up. But yesterday's strikes by Israel were in direct response to an attack by Iran on Israel on the 1st of October, in which Iran sent around 180 ballistic missiles towards Israel and did some significant damage on Israeli military facilities. It was more significant than actually was publicized immediately after those strikes. And so that was what Israel was responding to yesterday. And in the past month or so, Israel has been given the use of a new defense air defence system from the United States, a very advanced one called THAAD, and there's some suggestion, no hard evidence, but that might have been part of the deal. The US supplied a more high-tech air defence system. There's only 6 of them in the world to Israel, and in response, Israel did not go for the jugular yesterday with Iran and undertook a more moderate response than we might have expected.
What's the name of that air defence system again?
It's called THAAD, THAAD. It's an acronym. Don't ask me to
don't worry.
spell out all the words. It begins with terminal and then high altitude. Terminal, high altitude,
something defence, yeah.
I think something like that.
Is that something that's like the Iron Dome 2.0, or is it something completely different?
I think it's on that spectrum. So there are only half a dozen of them in the world. There was one station a number of years ago in South Korea that really angered China quite significantly. So it's clearly got an awful lot of capability. It's got a lot of high-tech radar capability, and in some ways it's surprising that it hasn't been stationed in Israel already. But it just shows that the threat is quite severe from Israel's perspective, and they've shored themselves up with that new system. Perhaps in exchange they didn't, as I say, undertake a more widespread attack yesterday.
Because Iran has its own air defence system. How much of of Israel's attack was actually repelled? Do we know what sort of proportion of missiles got through?
I think very little. I mean, Israel's technology is, it is very, very, it's a very high standard, and that's because it's largely developed in coordination with the United States, and they have one of the most advanced militaries, if not the most advanced military in the world. Iran simply does not. So Israel did significant damage to air defence facilities in Iran yesterday, going by the reports, and that will be significant if Israel wants to undertake future attacks. Iran's air defence systems have been knocked out effectively, and yes, they'll rebuild them, no doubt, but that will take time, and that's what's in it for Israel.
Well, I guess there are two ways from a layman's point of view, there's two ways of looking at it. That they've softened up the air defences so they can have another crack at them, but one might argue they've softened up the air defence system so they can simply say, no more from you. Otherwise, we're going to hit you harder and you won't be able to defend yourselves. Is that a fair sort of tit for tat?
I think both of those are true, Tim. Certainly, those attacks yesterday by Israel, they've destroyed missile production, missile launch facilities, air defence facilities. This is significant in deterring future strikes by Iran. It's not crippling in the sense because it didn't go for, some of the, as I say, those other targets. It won't lead to a full-scale war. Iran has played down the attacks, saying there's only limited damage. So they're not looking to undertake another round of retaliation here against Israel. And it's to everyone's benefit. We've seen an awful lot of escalation in the Middle East over the past year, and I think it will do everyone good to take a breath and step back for a moment. And I think we need to go for diplomacy, dialogue, de-escalation here, and that's something that many countries have been working on over the past year. It's all started with Gaza, it's expanded to Lebanon, to Syria, to Iraq, to Iran. We all need to step back here, and what's been happening, we've just seen a wave after wave of escalation, and I think if anything, we've learned anything over the past year is that escalation simply begets more escalation. And sadly, we've got to look at this wider context as well with a US election just around the corner. And, if the polls are right, Donald Trump is in the box seat to win those. He is very anti-Iran in his views and very much against Iran's nuclear program. I just wonder whether Benjamin Netanyahu's waiting and seeing, look, Trump's in the box seat to win this election. Let's do something bigger on the other side of November the 5th.
Well, so Biden said he's hopeful it'll mark the end of a months-long cycle of escalation. What's your view?
Well, look, I think you're a very brave person to think this is ever the end. We've just seen just wave and wave of escalation over the past year. If you just think where this all began on October the 7th, 2023, and where we are now, we've gone from this to being just about Gaza to being about Lebanon, Hezbollah. We've seen just escalation throughout the Middle East, no matter where you look. Israel says it's fighting a seventh front war because when you count up all the enemies it's facing, from the Houthis in Yemen through to the West Bank, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Gaza, you end up with 7 fronts. And that's the situation we're in. now. We're in a wider regional war. So, yes, things could have been worse yesterday, but I think they're bad enough as they are, and I think we need to just keep speaking out in favour of the de-escalation route. Apparently there are more ceasefire talks underway in Doha again with Gaza, and I think we just need to go back to the political solutions, because you won't solve this conflict with a military response.
Do you think that Iran will respond?
For now, I don't think they have plans to. From the messaging that's coming out, they're saying limited damage, saying that their Israeli response was weak. They had regular programming on state TV. They're not hyping things up.
Sort of brushing it off, are they, in a way?
Yeah, well, I think real damage was done to the military facilities, but they're not looking to make a big thing of it, which you would expect if they were planning on undertaking yet another round of retaliation. But remember, this is the second tit-for-tat escalation we've seen this year, direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. There was one back in April, so it was only 6 months ago. So I think the way we should probably see this, the current round is over, but there will be, sadly, almost certainly future rounds of escalation, unless we diffuse all of this through political solutions.
Well, I am going to ask you, it feels like a rhetorical question, because I almost think that the answer is no. But anyway, would return of the hostages make any difference, or are we well beyond that now?
I think it would make some difference. I mean, a return of the hostages is part of a ceasefire deal. I think a ceasefire in Gaza would be fantastic. I think a ceasefire in Lebanon would be fantastic. Israel has met an awful lot of its objectives by now, and you go back to April, Joe Biden told Benjamin Netanyahu to take the win after the round of escalation then with Iran, and I think perhaps those words, take the win, should be the message to Israel right now, just given what's happened. They've killed Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in Gaza. They've killed Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas. They've killed Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. They've caused an awful lot of damage in Lebanon and Gaza. 42,000 people in Gaza have been killed, 2,500 in Lebanon. At some point, I think you need to, quote-unquote, take the win and just stop and go for a political solution, go for ceasefires, go for diplomacy. I think that should be the message for Benjamin Netanyahu right now. I'm not sure if he's willing to hear it. I think he's looking ahead, and he's seeing Donald Trump as in the box seat to be in the White House, and an awful lot more could play out under a Trump presidency, that's for sure.
Right. So do you think that if Trump doesn't make the White House, that there is more of a prospect of success in securing peace?
Well, yes and no, because Joe Biden certainly hasn't been very successful over the past year overall in convincing Benjamin Netanyahu to step back. I don't think there's any guarantee at all that Kamala Harris would be more successful with Benjamin Netanyahu at all. So, the situation's pretty bleak, but yet I think we always have to be, even as when it seems so bleak, we have to be hopeful, we have to be optimistic, we have to keep trying for peace and keep trying that diplomatic route. And I do think New Zealand can play just a small part, but a significant part in that global picture. And I think Winston Peters would do well to head to the Middle East at some point. He's only had a very brief stop in the Middle East over the past year. I think New Zealand could play a small part in those overall peace efforts by working together with friends and partners in the Middle East and outside the region.
We can get Winston to go, give them a good telling off. Just one last cynical question. Netanyahu, up before all this happened, was facing corruption charges. Is there, and cynically speaking, if I was just having a cup of coffee with someone, I'd say, well, he's not going to resolve it, because as soon as everything's over, he's in trouble. So it's almost in his vested interest to continue with this stuff, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Indeed, the day the war ends, Benjamin Netanyahu's career ends effectively, and he goes back to fighting all these corruption charges. I think from Netanyahu's perspective, he probably feels that he's redeemed himself. There was that huge security failure over October the 7th that allowed that massive attack by Hamas on Israel. But since then, particularly the various assassinations of the leadership of Hamas and Hezbollah, the destruction of so many Hezbollah facilities in Lebanon and Beirut, and Hezbollah infrastructure in southern Lebanon, the destruction of Hamas in Gaza. He probably feels he's redeemed himself, but yet he is only going to face an awful lot of trouble if he resigns or is sacked as PM. So he's got every reason to continue for as long as humanly possible. I mean, I think he's 75 now, so he probably feels that he's still got a lot to contribute and a lot to play for.
Taking him out in the box. Hey, Jeffrey, I really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thanks so much for your insight.
You're very welcome.
There we go. Thanks. That is Geoffrey Mill. He is a geopolitical analyst. And yeah, actually, that's fascinating insights into the whole thing.